Good evening and welcome to the 2021 State of the City. I am Dr. Lisa Hernandez, the Public Health Officer for the City of Berkeley, and I am so happy that you are here. I have worked for the City of Berkeley for nearly 4 years, where I lead a team made up of public health nurses, community outreach workers, epidemiologists, physicians, and other public health professionals. We are all committed to eliminating health disparities and inequities in Berkeley. We provide service for individuals and families and work together to address the social, economic, educational, and environmental inequities that affect the health here in the city of Berkeley. Public health works to ensure the health and well-being of all Berkeley residents and believes that every person in Berkeley has the right to good health. Berkeley is unique as we are one of just 3 cities in California having its own public health department, which typically is operated on the county level. Having a city level public health department has enabled us to provide focused resources for our community during the pandemic. Many residents may never have heard about me or public health until about 20 months ago, when we were placed right in the spotlight by the COVID-19 pandemic. Pandemics are part of my work that we hope would never have had to address, but we have always been preparing for it. When COVID-19 first emerged, we quickly began implementing our plans and prepared for a possible pandemic, even before the first case hit the Bay Area. Thanks to the support of the mayor, council, and the city manager, our swift and decisive actions saved lives. While these actions did have economic ramifications, the reality is not taking these actions that we did would have had a more catastrophic impact on the health and economy of our city and our nation. Over the past 20 months, the mayor, city manager, and I participated in a series of town halls to prepare the community updates on COVID-19. And to continue that tradition, let me provide you with a brief update on the latest COVID data. As of today, there have been 5,177 cases of COVID-19 and 55 deaths in the city of Berkeley, with an average case rate of about 6.9, almost 7 cases per 100,000 over the last 7 days. 105,143 people have been fully vaccinated, and that represents 88% of our total population. And vaccinations are currently underway for people age 5 through 11. And I'm really happy to say that nearly 46% of this population is vaccinated. This remains one of the highest vaccination rates in the nation. We recently relaxed our mask requirements for certain businesses, and we continue to monitor cases, which will help us decide when changes are appropriate to our health orders. I really want to extend a thank you and an appreciation to our Berkeley residents for your commitment to science and adherence to social distancing protocols, making Berkeley a prime example of what to do in a pandemic. For more information, including data and how to get tested or vaccinated, visit our website at cityofberkeley.info/COVID-19. But today, I'm excited to introduce tonight's panel, who will be part of the conversation. Alex Savage, he anchors the 4 and 7 p.m. newscasts at KTVU and KTVU+. He's been working as a journalist for nearly 20 years, with half of that time spent at Channel 2. Alex grew up in Berkeley and now lives in the city with his wife and 2 kids, with his parents just up the street. I know that arrangement very well myself. When he's not covering the news across the Bay Area, Alex loves bike rides to the marina with his family, cooking elaborate dinners, and watching the Warriors. Welcome, Alex. Rachel SWAN is a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, where she has worked since 2015. She was born in Alta Bates Hospital on Ashby Avenue, She grew up in the East Bay and graduated from UC Berkeley. Go Bears. She is now raising 2 daughters in El Cerrito. Welcome, Rachel. And now it is my honor to introduce the mayor of our great city, JESSE Arreguín.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, for that kind introduction. I just have to say that Berkeley is fortunate to have an experienced public health professional leading our pandemic response. And your commitment to our community's values of equity and believing in science has gotten us through one of the most difficult times in our city's history. We know that throughout the country, public health officials have faced enormous stress and criticism, even receiving death threats. And I want you to know that Berkeley stands with you. We appreciate all the hard work by you and our public health division, along with the hundreds of city employees who are part of our emergency response. And so your efforts have helped save lives, keep case rates comparatively low, while, as noted in your comments, having one of the highest vaccination rates in the country. And that is no easy accomplishment. So thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez, for joining us this evening. I also want to thank our first responders and all of our frontline workers for their hard work and sacrifice. And I recognize the challenges that they've faced this past year. I want to take a brief moment of silence to honor the 760,000 people who lost their lives to this terrible virus in the United States, including 55 individuals here in the city of Berkeley. So please join me for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. COVID-19 continues to dominate our daily lives. And since our world changed in March 2020, and it seems like a lifetime ago, we've continuously adapted to these changes, working to preserve our community's health and its economy, both of which have been challenged by this virus. And what I can tell you today, over 18 months since the pandemic began, is that Berkeley is incredibly strong and resilient. This is a community that has a lot to be proud of. And while there are other communities and states that were torn apart by conspiracy theories and disinformation, this city came together. We trusted science and the data, and today we have one of the nation's highest vaccination rates. So thank you to the people of Berkeley for your commitment to keeping our community safe. Building upon the work that we undertook last year to support the people and the businesses and the nonprofits that have been impacted, we're now turning to rebuilding. And this includes acceleration of creating parklets and outdoor spaces, supporting our small businesses, getting people back to work, and ensuring that our commercial and residential tenants remain protected after the state's eviction moratorium has expired. Once vaccines became publicly available, we worked on expanding access, opening the first and longest running mass vaccination site in the county, and creating an equity outreach campaign to make sure that all Berkeley residents, every corner of the city, had an opportunity to get vaccinated, and that work continues. While adapting to COVID-19 and addressing this emergency, our efforts continue on other priorities to promote our community's resilience in an ever-changing world. And with the COP26 conference on climate change having concluded, we're now left with mixed results. If everyone does their part right now, we can keep global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, the threshold that would lead to catastrophic climate change if surpassed. But this is really the best case scenario. And sadly, the reality is that it is too late to undo much of the damage that humanity has caused to our environment, but we must continue to address this climate emergency. I'm proud that Berkeley's been at the forefront of environmental issues, and 2 years ago, and I want to recognize Councilmember Kate Harrison for her leadership, we adopted a groundbreaking law ending the use of polluting natural gas in new construction, which is actually responsible for 31% of greenhouse gas emissions in Berkeley. Today, over 50 jurisdictions have approved similar policies, with many more on the way. So combating climate change and ending our reliance on fossil fuels requires bold action in how we build, how we commute, and how we live. And Berkeley has set a goal of ending our reliance on fossil fuels by no later than 2030. So decarbonizing our city is really key to this effort. This year, we voted to have our local energy provider, East Bay Community Energy, upgrade all Berkeley customer accounts to 100% clean, local, and renewable energy, which will go into effect next year. And we're in the process of transitioning our city vehicle fleet to 100% electric and to phase out the sale of gas combustion vehicles in the city over the next 6 years. Key also to fighting climate change is building dense infill housing close to transit. And we're now planning for thousands of new homes at our Ashby and North Berkeley BART stations. But we also know we're feeling the effects of our climate emergency with rising sea levels and worsening wildfires. And Berkeley has a bay on one side of our city and the East Bay Hills on the other, and is especially vulnerable to hazards. And that is why we're taking proactive action by not only planning for sea level rise adaptation at our waterfront, but making unprecedented investments in wildfire prevention, vegetation management, and emergency response, thanks to the passage of Measure FF last year. So our efforts to promote resiliency will continue in the coming years. Like most communities in the Bay Area, the most visible challenge is homelessness. And we've made significant efforts over this past year, opening up new shelters, including the Horizon Transitional Village and a safe RV parking site. And this builds on the work the city's been engaged in over the past 5 years to triple our shelter beds. We've also been working to address the impacts of unsheltered homelessness through a compassionate response, providing sanitation and referrals for social services and shelter to individuals living in encampments through our homeless response team. Collectively, these efforts have enabled us to house over 500 people in the city over these last few years, but we're not content. We know that there's much more we need to do. So that's why we're accelerating the creation of affordable housing, including the Berkeley Way Apartments and Hope Center, the city's largest affordable housing development slated to open next year. We also took steps to address decades of racial segregation in housing by adopting a resolution this year to end exclusionary zoning. And we're now planning for roughly 9,000 new housing units, with the university also building more housing for its students. We're also at the forefront of a national dialogue on police reform, which will make us safer and bring us closer to achieving our dream of equal justice for all. So in closing, we'd hoped to do this event in person, and we felt it was best to do this virtually to maximize the number of people who can participate, including those of us who are not quite ready to return to a large in-person event. And with concerns of a potential winter COVID surge, we need to continue to be vigilant and safe. So as a refresher, instead of giving a lengthy speech last year, we had a dialogue with local journalists to make this an even more dynamic and engaging event. And given the success of last year's format and the current public health emergency, we decided to do it again. So I'm excited to be joined tonight by Alex Savage from KTVU News and Rachel SWAN from the San Francisco Chronicle, who will both be leading this discussion with questions on a wide range of issues Berkeley residents care about. So with that, Alex, let's get the conversation started.
Sounds great, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, really appreciate you inviting me tonight. It's an honor to be here as someone who again grew up in Berkeley and is now fortunate enough to be living here and raising a family here once again. It's really nice to be here. Throughout the next hour, my colleague Rachel SWAN from the San Francisco Chronicle and we are going to be moving through a broad range of issues with Mayor Arreguín, talking about some of the most pertinent issues facing the city. You just heard about many of them. Of course, we're going to talk about the effort to build more affordable housing in Berkeley and the steps being taken to address homelessness. We're also going to dive deeper into the city's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Where do we stand in the vaccine rollout for adults, for school-aged children? Obviously, a lot of parents out there, including myself, are curious about how that effort is going. We're also going to talk about what comes next in the push to vaccinate city employees in Berkeley. As the mayor also mentioned, we will be talking about the efforts in Berkeley to reimagine public safety, what that looks like in the city and how the city's police department might change in the future. Also, climate change, such an important issue in Berkeley and of course around the world. We're going to ask the mayor about his plans to better prepare the city of Berkeley for catastrophic wildfires, which we are seeing more and more of these days. And of course, we want to talk with the mayor about what is being done to make the city more friendly for bicyclists and pedestrians. And we're even going to touch on that debate over the hot topic debate about whether to add bike lanes on Hopkins Street in North Berkeley. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. Rachel and I are going to get right to it. And of course, we want to start with the housing crisis, confronting the housing crisis in the city of Berkeley, such an important issue here. And as the mayor touched on here, the city has a mandate to add almost 9,000 new housing units over the next decade or so. So the question, Mr. Mayor, for you is, what are going to be the most effective strategies to build all of that housing? And how do you do it while continuing to keep a focus on affordability and on equity?
Great question, Alex. Well, I think we're going to do it in a number of ways, not only building housing in our downtown and around our BART stations. Excited that we started an effort a couple of years ago to begin planning for several thousand units of housing in our North Berkeley and Ashby station with a focus on maximizing affordability. We're also going to do it by allowing multi-unit housing in our residential neighborhoods, accessory dwelling units, making it easier for people to build backyard units, and also by looking at preserving existing housing, keeping it permanently affordable, and then also looking at how we can build as much affordable housing as possible on public land, so that we can keep people in our community who are facing housing insecurity and seeing rising housing costs stay in our communities. So it's really going to take an all of the above approach. And I want to not only meet the 9,000 unit target, but exceed that target. And I think we have a responsibility to do that, to address decades of underproduction in Berkeley and in the region. We're going to have 4 million more people in the San Francisco Bay Area region over the next several decades. Where are they going to live? And how are we not only going to keep the people that are in Berkeley still here, but plan for future growth that we're going to have in our regions? So I think this is an exciting opportunity to plan the future of our city. And we're going to do it in an inclusive community process, which we launched actually earlier this year, one of the first cities in the Bay Area to launch our process of updating our housing element. And the goal is to engage every part of our city in that conversation.
Thanks for having me on. Also related to the housing issue, in your opening remarks, you touched on one of the most intractable issues, not only in Berkeley, but in the Bay Area, which is homelessness. Mentioned some new shelters, some RV sites. Can you just talk a little bit more about, we're still seeing some encampments and, particularly in West Berkeley, a lot of RVs. How are you going to move this population into permanent housing?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to build housing so that we can address the current shortage in our city, in our region, our state. We know that homelessness is a direct result of our lack of available and affordable housing. And so we need to do a number of things. We not only need to build new permanent supportive housing, we need to lease buildings to provide units for people. We also need to look at more affordable and innovative ways of building housing, such as through pallet shelter communities, and looking at modular housing as a way to get housing built faster and more affordable. One of the biggest challenges we face in building housing quick enough is the amount of time it takes to build housing through our entitlement process. And we do need to streamline the process, but maintain our community's voice in that process. But in addition, we also need to look at how we can reduce the cost of building housing through not only increasing the construction labor pool, but also through innovative ways of building housing. And so all these are things that we need to focus on. There's been a lot of work on the state level to streamline regulations, but we need to take action at the local level to make it easier for people to build housing also.
Mr. Mayor, one final point here on the housing and the homelessness issue, obviously intertwined here, but talk a little bit, if you could, about the process of figuring out where you are going to build all of those additional housing units. I know two of the locations where a lot of those housing units are going to be potentially built are the site of the North Berkeley BART station and the Ashby BART station as well. There's debate right now about how big those complexes are going to be, whether it's 7 stories or even higher than that in North Berkeley. And you have pushback from a lot of neighbors who don't necessarily agree with how the look of and the feel of the neighborhood is going to change. What do you say to people who are a bit hesitant about moving forward with some of these larger projects like the ones that you are looking at the 2 BART stations?
I'd say 2 things. One, that we are going to make sure that you have a voice in the decisions that we're making about how we're going to grow. Because oftentimes people feel like they're not included. And we look at the history of planning in this country with urban renewal and redevelopment. Decisions were made to clear out whole neighborhoods, and that's not going to happen. We're going to do this in an inclusive way. But secondly, change has to come at some point. And we're facing a climate crisis, we're facing a housing crisis, a homeless crisis, and that's going to require that we take bold action. And I think everyone agrees in Berkeley that we have a housing crisis, and that the status quo is not working. And so, we are going to have to, open our minds and open our hearts to the idea that we need to welcome new people in our neighborhoods, that we need to build more housing. I think that if we really believe as a city in equity and inclusion, we need to make sure that we are opening the doors of opportunity for people to live in our city, including in every neighborhood in our city. And the fact that Berkeley in 1916 was the first city to pass single-family zoning, to prevent a dance hall in the exclusive Elmwood district, to keep people of color out of the Elmwood district, is the foundation that single-family zoning in Berkeley and throughout the country is built upon. It's built on racism. We know that that was also furthered through redlining and other discriminatory and racist policies that were put forward, over a whole generation. And so, last year we saw people, thousands of people, march in the streets of Berkeley and throughout the country, demanding that we address systemic racism. And if we do believe that Black Lives Matter and that we need to address systemic racism, we need to recognize that there is systemic racism also in our housing policies and our land use policies, and we need to dismantle those structures of exclusion and open the doors of opportunity for people to live in every part of our city. So, I think we need to recognize that if we want to solve this housing crisis, we want to solve this homelessness crisis, it is going to mean that we have to create more housing in our community, but we are going to do it in a way that includes the voices of our residents in helping plan the future of our city.
All right, we could obviously talk about the housing issue and the homelessness issue for a lot longer than this, but in the interest of time and covering all the topics we want to get to, we'll move on here, Mayor, and we'll talk about the COVID-19 pandemic here and the effort to keep people in Berkeley safe and healthy throughout this public health crisis. We just heard the numbers here at the top of the evening here at the beginning of the conversation from Dr. Hernandez. 88% of the total population here in the city of Berkeley now fully vaccinated, and we have 46% of younger kids, 5 to 11-year-olds, who are vaccinated as well. Mayor, are you satisfied with the progress being made on the vaccine rollout in Berkeley?
Absolutely. Actually, 45.8% of children ages 5 through 11 in Berkeley are vaccinated. That's higher than the state average of 8% and the regional average of 16 to 20%. That's a huge accomplishment. And I just want to recognize the work of our public health division. And as well, thank you to the parents for, recognizing that vaccines are safe and effective. And it's really critical for us to control the spread of COVID-19 and to help us get through this phase of the pandemic. We have to recognize that we're going to be living with COVID for many years. And so it's a question of how we are keeping our community safe, how we are adapting. But I'm proud of the fact that in Berkeley, we have really believed in science and followed public health guidance. And the fact that we've had over 95% vaccination rate, and then we add the 5 through 11-year-olds, 88%, that's a huge accomplishment. But we know that we need to continue to work to get everyone in our community vaccinated. And, early on, in the year, when vaccines were starting to get rolled out, we not only worked to get our mass vac site open, but, I was seeing who is getting vaccinated. And the people that have been most disproportionately affected by COVID-19, who've largely been, essential workers and our Black and Latinx population, they were not getting vaccinated at high numbers. And so we really felt it was important that we have a robust outreach effort to reach out in our neighborhoods, to our faith community, to trusted messengers, to get the word out about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and to also make sure that we are getting our Black and Latinx population and people throughout our city vaccinated, because that is going to be really key. And I'm proud that we've made progress, but there's a lot more work to do.
Mayor, we have started to see in other Bay Area cities, city employees on the path to termination if they don't comply with vaccine mandates. We're also seeing schools wrestle with how they're going to deal with vaccine mandates. Can you talk about how this process is going to play out in Berkeley? Would you ultimately advocate dismissing employees who don't get vaccinated?
Well, I strongly support the vaccine mandate that the city manager has implemented in Berkeley. fact, I've been advocating it for many months before the city manager implemented it. Given the spread of the Delta variant and other variants, I really feel it's critical to protect our employees and to protect the public, many of whom are interacting with the public on a regular basis, police officers, firefighters, refuse workers, that our staff are fully vaccinated. And I know that there is some mistrust around the safety and efficacy of vaccines by some, and we're working to provide information to those employees and to encourage them to get vaccinated. But at the end of the day, this is about keeping our city government safe and keeping our city safe. And so, we have to make it clear that if people aren't vaccinated, there are consequences. There is disciplinary action that will be taken. And so, the city is prepared, if necessary, if there are employees that still, after repeated efforts, outreach and efforts to comply, do not get vaccinated, we are going to have to escalate our disciplinary action. Based on preliminary information that I've heard to date, we have very high numbers of our city employees vaccinated. We're going to release those numbers soon. And so our work continues, but we do need to make sure, just as we've implemented business mandates for proof of vaccination, which I also strongly believe is really critical to protecting our employees and our businesses and visitors and residents, we need to apply the same principle that this is important for public health and public safety.
One last question on COVID here. I mean, just sort of as a parent, and I'm sure there's other parents tuning in and wondering about getting their kids vaccinated if they haven't been already. We've already seen a couple of vaccination clinics in the Berkeley schools. Mayor, are there plans in the works to ramp those up and try to get to meet more kids where they are at school and get them the vaccine?
Absolutely. We're planning on having a number of vaccine clinics at school sites. We're prioritizing our walk-up clinics right now for vaccinations for children 5 through 11. So, while many people are looking, and I did this just yesterday, looking at where I can get my booster shot, many of the vaccine clinics in Berkeley are focused on vaccinating children, which is really critical. And I just want to recognize the challenges that parents and teachers have faced this past year. Our kids were not able to go to school for many, many months. And, the impact that has had on our kids in terms of mental health and socialization is significant. And the learning loss and the achievement gap that we're going to have to address after the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we had one of the highest racial achievement gaps in the state of California. And that gap is now probably a chasm. And we have a lot of work to do to make sure we can ensure that every student, regardless of age or income or color of their skin, has the same opportunities as other students. So, we are going to continue to work in partnership with the school district to get as many students vaccinated. Thank you to the 45.8% of children 5 through 11 who've gotten vaccinated and the parents, and we want to get that number up as high as possible.
All right, let's move on and talk about what is being done to get Berkeley back to business here after the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, the pandemic obviously still with us, but we hopefully are beginning to emerge from this pandemic here. How is Berkeley's economy withstanding the economic downturn that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic? And what is the city specifically doing to continue to support those small businesses that are still struggling? They might be back open now, but many of the small businesses in Berkeley are still struggling in terms of their bottom lines. What kind of help is the city continuing to provide to them here as the city tries to get back on its feet?
Well, early on in the pandemic, we launched the Berkeley Relief Fund, and we were able to provide $4.5 million in grants to small businesses, arts nonprofits, and residential tenants in our city. We helped hundreds of businesses through business continuity grants, anywhere from $1,000 to even larger. For arts organizations, we had larger grant amounts. Many businesses told me that was really critical because at the time they were waiting for PPP loans to become available and other state and federal assistance. And it really was a bridge to keep the lights on and keep people employed. We also launched the outdoor commerce program, and we're going to continue that so that businesses can operate safely. And it's really brought so much life and vibrancy back to our city. And we want to be able to continue that post-pandemic. We also have used some of our American Rescue Plan dollars to not only provide funding for the arts, but also support for our small businesses, including marketing assistance and other economic support. We have definitely seen an impact on our economy, no question about it. We've seen higher rates of unemployment. We've seen a drop in revenue. It definitely has impacted our city budget and it's made it very challenging for us to continue to provide essential city services. I'm proud that we closed a $40 million budget deficit last year and closed a nearly $30 million deficit this year. But we know that many businesses are continuing to struggle. And post-pandemic, we not only have to continue to provide economic assistance, look at how we can work with businesses who have rent debt, work with their landlords to help them pay off their rental debt so that they can keep their businesses open. But we also have to look at how we can make it easier for businesses to open in Berkeley and how we can attract new businesses. So I really think key to our economic recovery is not only going to be getting people back to work, but also making sure we keep our businesses going, which are really the lifeblood of our city.
Mayor, how are you managing this delicate balance between landlords and tenants, particularly the mom and pop landlords who need to maybe pay mortgages and may in fact be hurting right now?
Well, I think we've done that through a number of ways, through not only through providing economic assistance to businesses so they have the income streams to be able to make rent payments, but also providing support through our Office of Economic Development for how businesses can apply for loans and other state grants, but as well through our eviction moratorium. And we broaden that policy to say that, if you have lease provisions that say that, your assets are liable for your inability to pay rent, that, people can't come up after your homes or assets. And so, we have to recognize that, there are property owners who have been struggling because they've seen a loss of income, but businesses, have been really struggling over this past year. And so by providing protections against evictions, by, working with them to do outdoor commerce, making sure that they can apply for federal relief, I think all those things have made a big difference. And we're gonna have to work with businesses to negotiate with their landlords on how to pay back that back rent post-pandemic. And this is not only something we have to do for businesses, but also residential tenants. We're facing a potential cliff very soon with the lifting, at some point of the local state of emergency. We have to have a plan in place for how we're going to help support these businesses and residents so that we don't see a whole bunch of shuttered storefronts and we see more people experiencing homelessness on our streets. And that's going to be a focus of ours in the coming months.
All right, Mr. Mayor, let's move on here and talk about, you touched on it a moment ago, but what is being done to make sure that Berkeley has a balanced budget. You talked about closing deficits the last couple of years, but obviously during the pandemic, the city of Berkeley, like so many other cities, had to use millions of dollars in emergency funds during the pandemic. Has that money been replenished yet? And when you look ahead in terms of the budget outlook, how do things look, and what are the budget priorities for you now as we emerge from the pandemic?
As you noted, we faced a $40 million budget deficit last year, which required that we had to use our reserve to be able to help balance our budget. And I just want to recognize it wasn't too long ago that the Berkeley city government didn't even have a dedicated reserve for our general fund. And that's something that I really prioritized to make sure that we were in a position to be able to keep city operations going and city services going in situations like a pandemic or an earthquake or another emergency. And so we're beginning to replenish that reserve, and that's going to be a priority in our city budget over the next year, while we're also addressing our long-term fiscal health of our city. My priorities for our city budget are addressing our public health emergency and making sure that we can continue to get people vaccinated, that we can respond effectively to this pandemic, making sure that we continue to maintain our infrastructure. Public safety, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about this evening, is also a very important priority. And then also addressing the sort of social impacts of the pandemic, impacts on businesses, impacts on our unhoused community. impacts on people who are experiencing housing insecurity. That needs to remain a focus. We also have to recognize that we're facing a lot of other challenges at the same time simultaneously. The climate emergency is worsening. We have threats of wildfire, given our location in the wildland urban interface. And then we also have a lot of other social challenges that we're facing, a housing and homelessness crisis. All those things have to remain our priority while we're also simultaneously addressing this public health emergency as well.
Mayor, I did want to ask like sort of a loosely economic question. Some of the programs that have emerged during the pandemic have had a real positive reception and, just economic, not just like economic booster programs, but even like the parklets and stuff that cities like Berkeley have done to preserve local businesses. Do you expect some of these programs to have real staying power, or is this something that's going to evaporate after 2021?
I certainly don't want it to go away. I think it really has been critical to help keep our businesses going. Small businesses represent the lion's share of our local economy, actually. And so it is really critical that we have a focus on how we're helping support and attract new small businesses, while we're also looking at how we can foster more economic growth in our city. One business sector that actually did really well in the pandemic was our innovation sector, biotech, advanced manufacturing. And I think we want to build on those strengths as well. Like I said, having, parklets, activating streets and public spaces has really brought new life to our downtown and our commercial districts. I hear constantly from people who say like, this is something we absolutely should continue. We've adopted legislation to enable those parklets to continue. We provided grants so that people can create parklets and convert public spaces for outdoor commerce. We also have to recognize that we've seen vandalism that's occurred during this pandemic. We've launched a business damage mitigation fund to help businesses who've had their windows broken, have seen other acts of vandalism. So we're really trying to address the needs of our businesses in a really comprehensive way, not just helping them stay in keep their businesses open through eviction protections, grants, but also help support their operations. And that's going to be a focus over the next year.
All right, Mayor, let's move on in the interest of time and focus on the effort in Berkeley to redefine public safety. Last year, following the killing of George Floyd, obviously that became a focal point for a lot of cities across the country. The city council at that time voted to reform the police department in a number of different ways, trying to shift officers away from traffic stops and also shift them away from answering calls, dealing with mental health crises and homelessness. And there was also a push by the city council, a pledge to cut the police department budget by 50% as well, as part of shifting resources in different directions. Is that still realistic, Mayor, to cut the Berkeley Police Department budget in half?
Well, the 50% goal was an aspirational goal. I don't think there was ever any, expectation that we would cut the police department by 50%. But the underlying principle was that, our police department budget is increasingly taking up a huge amount of our general fund. And at some point, that's going to make it difficult for Berkeley to invest in our infrastructure, provide other basic services. So we need to find a way to control the size and amount of our police department budget, while also providing effective public safety services to our residents. And I do believe that there are ways that we can reimagine public safety in Berkeley to not only make sure we have, a world-class police department. I want to recognize that we have an excellent police department, but also investing in alternative models of public safety, like an expanded mental health crisis response team. Looking at how we can invest in violence prevention programs to reduce gun violence, which is plaguing parts of our community. Making sure that we have more appropriate public safety services and investments. I think all those things, when we put that that plan in place will have an impact of creating a safer, healthier community, and make sure that our police are actually able to focus on what they were trained to do, which is addressing violent and serious crime. And so we've already launched efforts by not only looking at how we can prioritize traffic stops for the most risky behavior that's occurring on our streets, speeding, and other moving violations that pose the greatest risk to public safety. And that also has the effect of reducing pretext stops and reducing racial disparities in who our police are stopping. That's something that we're launching right now, while we're looking at how we can best deploy our police resources to have officers on bikes, in our commercial districts, in areas where we've seen high incidences of crime, and also, being able to deploy mental health workers to respond to mental health calls, because increasingly our police are being asked to be social workers and not being asked to focus on crime prevention. And I think we can create a system of public safety in Berkeley that can effectively address all these needs: violence prevention, addressing our mental health and social service needs in our community, and public safety.
Mayor, has the city experimented at all with using more civilian responders to, frankly, any of these things? Mental health or public disturbance calls, even traffic stops? I know this is something a lot of cities are grappling with.
Around traffic stops, currently we are not able to deploy unsworn officers to address traffic stops. That requires a change in state law. But we do have a mobile crisis team that already works very closely with our police department to respond to calls for service that involve welfare checks and individuals who are experiencing a mental health crisis. We don't have enough mobile crisis team workers. They don't operate 24/7. And so when a crisis does happen after hours, say at 2 a.m, we don't have anyone to deploy. And it means that a police officer has to step in. And while we do have crisis intervention training for our police department, that's not enough. We need to make sure we have 24/7 mental health care and services in Berkeley, to address the growing crisis that we're seeing on our streets. And so it's really about building on what we started, and also looking at how we can have code enforcement officers or unsworn personnel respond to noise disturbances, or other types of calls for service that do not pose an immediate threat to public safety. And that will free up our police officers' time to be able to focus on the more violent, serious crimes that we need them to be able to respond to more effectively.
Mr. Mayor, just one final follow-up on that. A lot of police departments are struggling to hire enough officers and have shortages when it comes to officers. I think of Oakland right next door. Does the Berkeley Police Department have enough officers right now? And if not, what steps are being taken to address that?
We are seeing a shortage, and that's due to retirements, mostly. And so, we have set a certain minimum staffing level, and we are actually increasing staffing to make sure we meet that minimum staffing level. So we have officers who can do patrols in our city. I think there is going to be a conversation over the next few months around how many police officers do we need in Berkeley, and what should their focus and functions be. And that's really, I think, the core of the whole conversation around reimagining public safety. There is a role for police in our public safety system. And it's a question of what they do and how best we can deploy them to address crime that we're seeing in our city, while we also are investing in the alternative response models that can help also free up officer time to focus on violent and serious crime. So we're focusing on trying to make sure we maintain minimum staffing levels. It's challenging. We're providing incentives so that we can get lateral transfers of officers from other departments. We're doing proactive outreach to different police departments to encourage people to join the Berkeley Police Department. It's going to take time for us to rebuild our police department. And this is something that cities throughout the country are seeing, but we're committed to doing it.
All right, let's move on here and talk about the issue of climate change, but more to the point, the threat of catastrophic wildfires. Obviously, we know these fires are growing larger and more destructive as a result of global warming. And so obviously a city like Berkeley has to prepare. As you talked about, Mayor, it's, up in the Berkeley Hills, especially, we have that urban wildland interface there. And as we know, any of us who grew up here know the threat of wildfires is very real. All you have to do is look back at the Oakland Hills firestorm. So what are the key steps that the city of Berkeley is taking right now to prepare for the threat of more catastrophic wildfires, especially in those hills communities?
Well, I remember the 91 Hills firestorm. I was not in Berkeley at the time. I was across the bay in San Francisco. I remember, looking at the sky and seeing the sky being orange and the sky's being choked in smoke. And sadly, that's a reality we're seeing on an almost weekly basis throughout the state of California now. And it's often we say that fire season is, during the summer months. Fire season is now year round. This year we had one of the earliest red flag warnings that we've ever had. We've had to encourage residents to pre-evacuate certain parts of the Berkeley Hills because of the immediate fire risks during red flag days. And so we don't have time to waste. We have to act urgently to address the threat of wildfire. I'm pleased that the state of California, this governor, has really prioritized investments in wildfire mitigation. And we hope to work with our neighboring agencies to be able to not only access those resources, but work collaboratively to address the threat. But thank you to the voters of Berkeley last year who passed Measure FF, a tax measure that's providing $12 million a year for the city of Berkeley to expand vegetation management, wildfire prevention. We're going to be implementing an emergency warning signal so that people know when they have to evacuate. We're continuing our efforts to educate the community about what to do in the event of a wildfire. Where do you go? How do you safely evacuate? What's really going to be key is working with our parks, with our regional park system, the university, and each individual property owner to take action to remove hazardous fuels and to reduce the threats. And that's the focus of ours right now. And with these resources, we're going to be able to do a lot more. But we have to do it in partnership with all of our regional partners. And so one of the things that is in conversation right now is a regional joint powers authority for wildfire planning and mitigation. And I think that recognizes that, like housing, like homelessness, this is a regional issue that requires a regional response. And we hope to be able to build on the great work that we've done with other fire departments.
Mayor, one issue playing into the wildfire conversation in Berkeley is ADUs. The way Alex and I understood it, the process to build ADUs has been simplified in the flats, but there's a lot of debate about how to handle ADU construction in the Hills area of Berkeley. Can you say a little bit about where you stand?
Sure. I believe that we can build housing, but we need to recognize that some of our streets in our hills are very narrow, and it's very difficult for people to evacuate. And so we need to, I think, look even more carefully at adding more density in those areas. And that's not to say that people can't build accessory dwelling units, but looking at the size of the projects, what the parking requirements are. I have to recognize that another big issue is people parking their vehicles on these very narrow streets. And so a program that we actually launched a few years ago and that we're actually going to be working to relaunch, it's called our Safe Passages program, which is focused on actually red curbing some of those streets so that, when emergency vehicles and people have to evacuate, that we have proper egress. And it's going to be controversial. There's no question about it. But we have to recognize that this is a step that we have to take to keep some of these neighborhoods safe and to make sure that people can safely evacuate. So, the Berkeley City Council will be discussing in the coming months, specific regulations for ADUs in the fire zones 2 and 3. And I think we can allow additional ADUs, such as ADUs within existing structures, but we have to give special consideration to the types of regulations we establish in those areas.
All right. Again, in the interest of time, to sort of keep us somewhat on schedule, I'm gonna move on to the next topic here, Mayor. Building Back Better, in Berkeley, and specifically, let's talk about transportation issues in the city. I mean, obviously, Berkeley is already a very walkable city. I can attest to that. It's a city that people love to bike in and often feel safe biking in. But there's always more work to do. I know there's discussions now around maybe creating at some point in the future car-free streets, a portion of Telegraph potentially being turned into a car-free street. Can you talk about what your vision is to make Berkeley an even safer place for bicyclists and for pedestrians?
Well, I will say from personal experience as a bicyclist, I got an electric bicycle actually early this year. And it's just been an amazing thing. I encourage everyone to be part of the electric mobility revolution. But that being said, I'm keeping a running list of all the streets that are pothole ridden, sending those to the Public Works Department. We need to repave our streets, particularly our bicycle boulevards, so that they're safe for bicyclists. We also need to look at creating infrastructure in our streets for protected bicycle lanes, making street crossings safer for pedestrians. I think with particular focus around schools. We have many kids and parents who walk to and from school, and we need to look at how we make our streets safer around our schools. Berkeley has one of the highest bicycle commute rates of a city of our size in the United States. But if you ask bicyclists, many do not feel safe. We've increasingly seen in local news media, accidents, collisions of bicyclists and pedestrians and cars. So we need to recognize that, despite our efforts to encourage people to get out of their cars, we're not going to be effective in increasing the mode shares and trying to green our transportation if we don't make our streets safer. So we've adopted a Vision Zero policy, which sets the goal of ending injuries and fatalities by the year 2028. We want to accelerate that so that we get it done before 2028. So key to that's going to be enforcement, education of our laws to motorists, bicyclists, and pedestrians, and also how we design our streets with a focus on, creating safe spaces, crossings, infrastructure for bicyclists and pedestrians. That's our focus. And, you had mentioned the Hopkins corridor plan that's currently underway. And I think we have an opportunity to create protected bike lanes on Hopkins Street and maintain some street parking. I don't think we need to sacrifice one or the other, but I think, given, how dangerous our streets are to bicyclists currently, I think we need to have a focus on redesigning Hopkins for, as a multimodal corridor with a focus on bicyclists and pedestrian safety. I know there's been a lot of strong opinions expressed about that. I think we can find a way to balance those two things with a focus on, maximizing opportunities for people to bike safely on Hopkins.
Great. Just to one last follow-up. Mayor, you mentioned your congratulations on your e-bike. You mentioned you're keeping a tally of unsafe streets. I did get a message earlier from an old friend whose loved one suffered a traumatic brain injury and wound up in Highland earlier this year after a collision on a bike. So I guess I'm just wondering, what is going to happen to make the streets, not just Hopkins, but every street in Berkeley safer for cyclists?
Well, several things. Once again, enforcement is going to be critical. And I do think the conversation we're having about reimagining public safety and looking at creating a Department of Transportation with a real focus on, implementing our Vision Zero policies, I think is really critical. I just want to emphasize our Director of Transportation for the city of Berkeley, and this was actually in Berkeley side, was actually hit in a collision, not in Berkeley, but in Albany. I think just evidence the threats that we all face. And I can certainly attest to, almost being in a collision, most recently. So I think it's going to require that we really focus our dollars when we're repaving streets on creating protected bike infrastructure. It's going to mean that we educate bicyclists, motorists, and pedestrians about our laws, that we have smart enforcement. I think looking at things like automated speed cameras as a way where we can do more effective enforcement is something that we want to pursue. And we're actually in conversation about pursuing legislation in Sacramento to support that. I think all these things are really critical. And so, we're going to continue to work to advance our Vision Zero goal. And with, like I said, a particular focus around schools, because I often hear from parents how dangerous it is for them to cross major streets to take their kids to and from school. And, like I said, almost every week or month, we see stories about people that have been injured, some seriously injured in collisions, and it's not acceptable. We have to do better, and we're committed to trying to do better.
All right, Mayor, appreciate your time. We covered a lot of ground and a broad range of topics, and really had some good discussions. So I appreciate you doing it. Rachel, thanks to you.
Thank you so much, both of you, everyone.
Part of it. Yeah, and thank you everyone for tuning in and joining in the conversation virtually. We learned a lot about some really pertinent issues to people in the city of Berkeley. So I appreciate it. Mayor, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now for some closing remarks here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Alex and Rachel, for joining us tonight, and really appreciate the opportunity to have this important dialogue about issues important to the Berkeley community. And thank you, Dr. Hernandez, as well for that introduction and your ongoing service to our city. It's during times of crisis that brings out the best in us. And in the face of a crippling pandemic, Berkeley rose to the occasion. And beyond the work that we've discussed tonight, I want to highlight our community's response to this pandemic. Early on when the crisis was unfolding, residents and strangers teamed up to ensure that fellow neighbors were safe, creating networks to provide support to those in need. And I really believe that this best exemplifies Berkeley values, the values of compassion, respect for science, and resilience. While we have a long journey ahead of us, I'm immensely proud of the efforts all of us have done to collectively address one of the biggest challenges that we have faced. And we know that 2020 is going to be a year etched in history, and historians will look back at the decisions that we make today. Not just our response to the COVID-19 crisis, but the other issues of our time that are really coming at a crossroads. What did we do to address our housing and homeless crisis? What actions did we take to address the consequences of climate change? How do we respond to a nationwide push for police reform after centuries of systemic racism? I'm proud in Berkeley that we've taken significant actions to address these questions. Oftentimes, we see in communities that conversations and efforts have stalled or caused division in addressing these critical challenges. And from expanding our affordable housing stock to investing in wildfire safety and hazard mitigation, or leading nationwide discussions on transforming policing, we are not afraid to carve a new path forward for other jurisdictions to be inspired by. And over the past 5 years, I've been able to reflect on what it means to be mayor of this city, a city that we all love during such a pivotal moment in our humanity. And as we always have, Berkeley is in a unique position to be a leader and at the forefront of ingenuity. And, Berkeley really has been at the forefront of innovation in public policy, from, instituting curbside recycling, advocating for policies and infrastructure to support our disabled community, our groundbreaking leadership on environmental issues and social issues. I really believe it's that foundation of progressive leadership that we have to build upon and address the challenges that cities face now in the 21st century. So as mayor, it's my responsibility to foster that through community engagement and consensus building, because we're ultimately all in this together. And whether it's about building housing at our BART stations or reimagining public safety, we all deserve a seat at the table. And in a city that is civically active as ours, I'm really proud and humbled at the work we have achieved together and the work that we will achieve together going forward. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.